Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I am Stephen. This is a slightly unusual episode of the Bureau. It's a recording of an event we held last October as part of our London Month of the Dead Festival. It features the writer, the magician, some would say, Alan Moore in conversation with the writer, Gary Lachman, and the artist, John Coulthart. The occasion was the publication of a book called The Bumper Book of Magic, which Alan had written with his friend, another writer of comics, the late Steve Moore, no relation, a book that had taken almost 20 years to come to publication. John Coulthart was the main artist and designer of the book. Alan is somewhat of a recluse these days, so it was great to have him with us to talk about the book, about his friend Steve Moore, about his practice of magic, about the unconscious, about dreams and creativity. And if you don't know Alan, you probably will know some of his works or the films that have been made of his works. He first gained recognition in the 80s with his work for the comic 2000 AD, then later with DC Comics for Swamp Thing, Watchmen, V for Vendetta, The Killing Joke, which explored the Joker's backstory in Batman. And in the 1990s, he created From Hell, an extraordinary take on the Jack the Ripper story, and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He's often been at odds with publishers and certainly with Hollywood, and has removed himself largely from the mainstream and writing comics in recent years, and has focused on writing novels and on his esoteric pursuits and the practice of a particular kind of magic, as we will hear. Gary Lachman, previous guest on the show and a mate of ours, was once the bass player for Blondie before he put down the plectrum and picked up the pen, gave up rock and roll for writing, and in the years since has become the UK's foremost writer on the esoteric. He's written over 25 books on all sorts of esoteric subjects, ranging from Carl Jung, Aleister Crowley, Helena Blavatsky. There's a whole bunch of others. He's particularly interested in pre-cognitive dreaming, which we also get into in this conversation. John Coulthart is a wonderful graphic artist who's worked with Alan and other writers on many projects. He's a cultural phenomenon in his own right. And we hear from the audience at the end with some interesting questions to Alan about his practice of magic. So to set the scene, we're in a large room in London with Gary Lachman, John Coulthart, and Alan Moore. And we start off with Gary talking. Here we go.
I'm very happy to meet you, Alan. Entirely flattered that Stephen asked me to contribute to this. And I thoroughly enjoyed the book. And it was a wonderful trip down memory lane to some degree for me because I'm not a practitioner, but some years ago I was involved in magic and did a ritual or two and all that and read the Kabbalah and things of that sort. And I knew nothing about Alexander and Glycon. How the hell did you ever find out about this character?
Well, this would have been, I was through a very vulnerable stage in my life. This would have been late 1993 when I had suddenly and inexplicably at my 40th birthday party announced that I was going to henceforth be a practicing magician, because it was at a biker bar. And I was slightly drunk, but the next morning I realised that I was going to have to somehow go through with this or look foolish. So I asked my friend Steve Moore how you actually went about, and he suggested that it would be a good thing if I actually found a deity or some sort of imaginary friend to actually guide me in sort of imaginary territory. And so it was about a few weeks thereafter where I was at Steve's place, and just as a matter of interest, he asked me if I'd ever seen Alexander's serpent icon. And I said no. And he showed me this book of Roman antiquities, and there on the cover, there was possibly the most gorgeous thing that I'd ever seen. Just this incredible looking snake with kind of sleepy Paris Hilton eyes and hair. he explained a little bit about it to me, and it seemed that, yeah, this was some sort of first century glove puppet and part of a strange Gnostic ventriloquist act. So I thought, yeah, well, this is obviously the kind of God that I could respect. It's something that's saying up front, I am a glove puppet. So I devoted myself to Glycon, and as our relationship has progressed, I've actually come to realize that this is an incredibly important entity. That it's the last created Roman god who was handled by the first archaeologically verifiable magician. And great hair, you know. So yeah, that's the story of how I first encountered Glycon, you know. But it's been a very fruitful 25 years since then, 30 years.
And besides being in a biker bar and a few sheets to the wind, what was your reason for becoming a ceremonial magician? Because, I mean, lots of people are in biker bars and
Yeah, that's true.
and
That's
it doesn't
true.
happen to them. So I'm just curious if there was another factor in there which you've left out.
With everything, I think that they generally it's a collision of different factors and events, and one of them was that I'd previous to being in this biker bar, yeah, which as you suggest, that's not the whole story, obviously, but previous to that, I've been working on From Hell and my book about Jack the Ripper with Eddie Campbell. And I'd got a scene in one of the early episodes where Dr. William Gull, the royal physician in ordinary, and his coachman, John Netley, are traveling around this kind of esoteric pentacle that I'd imagined sort of extending over London. They've stopped off, I think, in Earl's Court for a steak and kidney pie. And during their discussion over dinner, I had William Gold say that the one place that gods and demons inarguably exist is in the human mind, where they are real in all their grandeur and monstrosity. And I'd thought, yeah, that's a good sonorous sounding line. And then I thought, hang on, I can't think of a way in which that isn't true, which seems to me to have implications. So there was that. There was also the feeling that as a writer, I had perhaps gone as far as I was personally able to do within the bounds of rationality. So I figured that if I wanted to progress as a writer, I would probably have to take a step over that very blurred dividing line between rationality and what lies beyond rationality. So these were all factors that were sort of building up until the incident in the biker bar. This was like 1993. There was just a feeling that there was something just ahead that was luminous and wonderful, but that I would need to make some changes if I was going to get there. So, yeah, with the help of Steve, it all just kind of happened. We'd been talking for a while about why don't we start a secret society that is so secret that nobody actually belongs to it.
That sounds like the man who was Thursday.
Yeah, well,
G.K. Chesterton, right? Yeah.
It was also, I mean, as we say in the book, that the fact that we've got 5 albums out and now this gorgeous book, that kind of makes us the worst secret society in the history of mankind if you don't count the Freemasons. You know, we said, yeah, let's form this society, this non-society, and we got no idea what to call it. And then when I was in the recording studio with my musical partner, Tim Perkins, he was saying that maybe it's got a bit of a kind of Carnival Barker feel to it. And so I started writing this thing, and the phrase The Moon and Serpent, Grand Egyptian Theatre of Marvels. And I thought, that sounds good. You know, I'd like to not belong to that. So, yeah, that was how it all just kind of tumbled into being. And we found ourselves as the grand masters of this non-existent magical organization that, despite not existing, has actually turned out quite a bit of stuff in the last 30 years.
Oh, that's like the Rosicrucians.
Yeah,
In
exactly.
1614, there were no Rosicrucians, but John Andre Valentine put up the posters on the church door in Cassel, and come join the Rosicrucians. Everybody's looking for them, and you couldn't find them. That's why they were called the Invisibles. But then the people who tried to find the Rosicrucians became the Rosicrucians themselves.
Yeah,
a serious joke.
So much of magic, it's all made up and then it becomes real. This is how it works. Mind you, that is the same as practically everything else in existence. Somebody makes it up at some point. It all starts from the human imagination somewhere. Frau Anna Sprengel, the completely mythical woman who apparently had written a letter saying whoever finds this letter is entitled to form this magical order, the Geltische Dämmerung, which obviously that means like the golden tea time. It was mistranslated from the start. Everything. I mean, Austin Osman Spare's occult mentor, Mrs. Patterson, he'd made her up. It was probably the masturbation fantasy of a very imaginative 14-year-old boy that got out of hand. I mean, even if you look back at like the origins of, say, witchcraft, there aren't any reported trials in the classical world for witchcraft until long after the creation of Medea. You know, these things start out as fictions and then they somehow creep into reality through this semi-porous membrane that divides fiction from reality.
Well, Hermes Trismegistus, who's the godfather of magic.
He wasn't there.
The Hermetists who made him up, we don't know them. That's a strange thing. We know the Gnostics. We know some of the names of the Gnostics who were contemporary with the Hermetists in Alexandria, but we do not have a name of a single Hermetist. So that's a very strange kind of situation. We know the fictional character they invented, and he went on to be taken seriously as a real figure until early 1600s, when rising humanism, critical analysis led to the fact that he didn't exist. And hence that led to the downfall of the prestige of magic in the world. But the whole idea was like, well, it doesn't matter that he didn't really exist or not. But that's not all the imagination in the sense that it's all make-believe, because the imagination is the beginning of making it real, as you said.
Yes, well, this is it. It's like we have to differentiate. I would say that magic is inarguably all in our heads. But the thing is that to have something in our heads or to have something that's just imaginary, we translate that as that's not real. Yes, it is real. We have a physical world that we sort of bark our shins in and sort of bruise ourselves in and sort of, but we also exist in a world of consciousness. In fact, we probably exist more in the world of consciousness than we do in the material world, because actually it's only our consciousness of banging our shin and sort of doing physical things that is real to us. Just because things aren't physically real doesn't mean they're not real, and it doesn't mean that they can't massively affect the human world. I mean, look at, say, the gods of most of the monotheistic religions. They don't seem to be real, but there have been an awful lot of inquisitions and religious wars and all the rest of it that have had enormous consequences. So these things, they have to be treated as real. They're just differently real.
Well, this is what Blake said, a couple centuries ago. Well, the gods exist within the human breast. What you see it without, but it's actually within. Kind of prejudice to anything within, because that's considered just subjective. That's that's just in your head. I mean, that's the mainstream kind of thing. What you're saying is exactly, as far as I understand this esoteric, hermetic, Gnostic line, it's the inner world which antedates what we see outside.
This is something which has been growing strongly with me over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, that the world of the imagination, it's the world that this world is standing upon. It's the world that this world is predicated upon. It is the most important of the two worlds, if you look at it that way. And it's also the most enduring. If all the chairs in the world vanished overnight, there's probably some sort of science fiction story that I could make up that would explain that, But if they did, it wouldn't be a big deal. As long as we still had the idea of chairs, then we'd be fine. So the world of ideas is actually more substantial, more important. I've just done this series called The Long London Quintet, and in that it's taking up on Arthur Macken's idea that there is this blazing and somehow more true London that exists just beyond the one that we're familiar with. And it's all William Blake. It's all the fourfold heavenly city. I mean, when people said, and where do you talk to these angels? Where do you see these visions? Blake just said, in here. God looking through the window in Golden Square and angels in the trees at Peckham Roy. William Blake was the father of the Romantic movement, along with a lot of other things. The Romantics, they seem to have this sense that the world of ideas and the world of archetypes was a real world, that there was a reality that they were painting into being or writing into being. And that is definitely something that I would go along with 100%. I think it's the relatively simple concept that is at the heart of all magic, that thoughts are real.
Well, John and I were just talking about this earlier, about how he remarked how Theosophy, or any Besant and Bishop Leadbeater's book Thought Forms, was the start of abstract art, modern art.
I was thinking the other day about the surrealists and the unconscious. Gary and I were talking about the surrealists in the unconscious is one of the few areas where if you draw a Venn diagram with science, art, and magic, it's one of the few places, the unconscious, where the three intersect. Science usually doesn't want to have anything to do with magic. It's kind of beyond its purview. But scientists can't get rid of the unconscious. I mean, a lot of scientific breakthroughs is what Cormac McCarthy called the Kekulé problem. Why does the unconscious, throw up these answers? Kekulé, he was an organic chemist. He wanted the structure of the benzene molecule. And he had a dream of the Ouroboros serpent. He woke up and he realized that was, the
benzene ring.
And the thing that Cormac McCarthy says is, why does the unconscious communicate in these images? Why doesn't it just say it's a ring? Why does it have to choose it?
We're the one who uses the words. Although in some dreams you may get these enigmatic one-liners, but it's usually it's symbols.
The whole thing with the unconscious is that yes, it is the central pillar of psychoanalysis and psychiatry, and the unconscious was invented by Paracelsus. He was the first person to use the term. He also, I think, was it antisepsis and was it anesthetic? In many ways, Paracelsus, who used to engrave angel names backwards in a magical language upon things, and yet claimed not to be a magician. He was pretty much a magician. He is at the center of the idea of the unconscious, which is an accepted scientific idea. And as John said, it's that's the basis of an awful lot of art, well, certainly of surrealism. Why does it talk in the language that it does? Why doesn't it just say what it means? It can't. As Gary was saying, it's not verbal.
The thing that McCarthy was saying was it's not verbal, and yet how does it do it? That was the thing that he was confounded by. How does it come up with solutions which people who are skilled in mathematics and physics, high level people, they can't get it with their conscious minds, and yet the unconscious can provide solutions through dreams or reveries.
We know that, yes, the conscious mind produces everything, and the unconscious mind seems to be able to tell us all of these things, but we don't know what consciousness is. We do not really have a functional definition of what consciousness actually is. Science does not appear to be able to quantify consciousness in any way. So there's several questions there. I mean, I remember asking Steve Moore when we were talking about how divination systems might possibly work. And I remember saying to Steve, I suppose it all depends how many dimensions consciousness has. Is it flat? Is it perhaps a bit lumpy? Or does it have more dimensions than that? I remember reading at some later point that scientists had mapped what goes into a thought, an idea. And they said that it was almost, neurologically, it was almost like building up a sandcastle to a level of complexity, after which it collapses again. This is what happens in our thought processes. But they were saying that the way that these mental sandcastles build up has more than 3 dimensions. It has more than 4 dimensions. They were saying that they've got up to at least 8 dimensions in the formation of these things. Now, if consciousness has more than 3 dimensions, this would explain how the unconscious sometimes knows things in advance of the conscious. It's possible that the unconscious knows things from the future. There's that J.W. Dunn book, An Experiment with Time, where this was a very, very rational, engineer, a very scientifically minded man, who suddenly noticed that he'd had some prophetic dreams, seemingly so, and he started to look into it and found that both himself and a lot of his friends, when they actually wrote them down, were having a number of prophetic dreams. I suspect that the unconscious mind is not bounded in the same way that the conscious mind is, and it probably has to sort of communicate with us in riddles, surreal images, and stuff like that, because that is its language,
Well, it's interesting you mentioned J.W. Dunn, because I read that book in 1980, and I did what he said. If you want to find out whether you dream the future or not, just write your dreams down. And lo and behold, I did. And I've been keeping dream journals since then, off and on. And at the first lockdown here, I wrote a book called Dreaming Ahead of Time. And it was about the best picks out of my 40 plus years of writing my dreams down, of precognitive dreams and all that. And in fact, the inspiration for the book came from a talk I gave at a previous London Month of the Dead in Brompton Cemetery. And I gave a talk about hypnagogia, the in-between, the liminal state.
Uh-huh.
And that Dunn had some of these precognitive visions in that state. When he was testing it and all that. It is true. I mean, all you have to do, pay attention to your dreams, write them down, and then pay attention to what happens during the day. It tends to be your personal future. And I have to say, more times than not, it's absolutely trivial, mundane sorts of things that would not be interesting at all, except for the fact that they were precognitive.
Steve Moore was somebody who, for more than 30 years, he kept a rigid dream journal every day. And because I tend to forget an awful lot of my dreams because I'm saturated with hashish, basically, and you don't tend to remember your dreams. So if I wanted any kind of oniric fun, I would have to wait until I went down to Steve's house, and he would say, do you want to read my dream book for the last week or two? And so, yeah, I'd always read his dreams. Just before Steve's death, I'd been down there And we'd been having a little chat. Also, by the by, there'd been heavy rains recently. So when he'd been out for a walk around the top of Shooter's Hill, he'd come across this massive flooded area that was like an inland lake, just sort of there amongst the trees. And so we carried on with things. We had a bit of dinner, and he said, right, would you like to read my dream book? And I said, yeah, of course. So I was looking through it, and I came to a dream about he's in the Marvel Comics offices, and they're telling him that they're doing a book of Star Tigers. And I said, oh, so did you have this dream before you saw the copy of the book in the bookshops? And he said, what are you talking about? Because he didn't remember. As soon as he'd typed a dream, he'd forget it. So I explained to him, and he said, oh, I'm not sure. I better go and look in my journal. So he went and looked in his journals, and he said, no, I had the dream 2 days before I actually saw the thing in the bookshops. And then there was finally a dream about, I'm walking through Oxley's woods, and I come across this huge lake. And I said, right, so you presumably had this dream about the huge lake after you'd actually seen. So he went and had a look in his journal. Turned out he'd had that dream on the morning that he saw the huge lake. But by the time he saw the huge lake, he'd forgotten the dream. He'd forgotten writing it down. And then finally, when Steve died, I think he died on the Friday, and he was probably at his house all weekend dead. And when I hadn't heard from him by the Tuesday, I got my daughter to sort of check around and to get in touch with the police down at Plumstead. And they said that they'd send somebody up to check and see if Steve was all right. When they got there was a light on in his upstairs study window at the front, a sort of a dull bluish light, and the window was open. Unable to get a response at the front door, they borrowed a ladder from the neighbour, just 2 doors down, and placed the ladder up against the front of Steve's house by the front door, up to his study window. And the policeman went up the ladder, got in through the window, and Steve was dead on the floor. We went down there later that week to try and piece together what had happened. Steve must have died no later than 3 o'clock on the Friday afternoon. Quite sure about it. When we were looking through Steve's dream book for that last week before he died, 2 days before he died, there was this dream that said, there is a man putting a ladder against the front, beside the front door of my house, up to my study window. He climbs up the ladder and seals the window shut with plaster. That was a bit eerie. And then the woman 2 doors down, she could remember definitely seeing Steve on the Sunday morning, standing by his front door. She'd called out to him saying, it's a nice day. And he'd said, yes, isn't it? She thought, oh, I must have been mistaken about that if he was definitely dead on a Friday. But then the people next to her said that, yeah, they'd seen Steve on the Sunday as well, which was a bit annoying because both me and Steve were eternalists who really hadn't got any firm belief in ghosts. Probably Steve messing everybody about. And the dream book, yeah, it's absolutely true. You will find that the future starts leaking through if you engage in any way with your unconscious mind. Even as a writer, over my career, I've found numerous times where I've written something that it would make more sense if I'd written it after a certain event had happened rather than before. So I think that, yes, the unconscious is kind of timeless.
I think you're right there. And getting back to time, I did ask you, why now is this book coming out, just as you finish it, and why in that form? Are you trying to hide it in some way?
The form, that was decided right back in, I think, 2006, 2007, when we first launched the idea. And me and Steve decided that we wanted to do a book that was in many ways an antidote to an awful lot of the grimoires that had been released. We wanted something that didn't pretend to a secret knowledge that was all ours, that made it publicly available in language that was comprehensible, that was accessible to the ordinary person and not just to an elite of occultists. We also thought that it should represent magic as we experienced it, which is to say that magic is beautiful, it is psychedelic. Apparently, it has a sense of humor. It's very funny sometimes, and actually, it's quite a good thing that magic does have a sense of humor when you consider the parade of clowns have often been in magic service. You know, it's as well that magic can take a joke. So we wanted something that reflected that, and we also wanted something that I thought, if I'm going to do a big book of magic, exactly what it says, but I want it to be what a 7-year-old would imagine a book of magic to be like. I want it to look as wonderful as that, and to have that kind of feel to it, which kind of, it takes away from the solemnity of the thing. It's more inviting. It's more playful. Yes, it is for adults. And we've got on the back, for adults only.
How small is the print?
Fairly small, microscopic. It's got adult content in, and it isn't for children, much as it does look like that. I mean, with John's beautiful, absolutely gorgeous design work on it. With it does look exactly like the best Christmas annual that you never had, which was, we wanted that. That reflected how magic seemed to us. As to why it came out when it did, Steve's passing in 2014, we were just finishing the writing of the book. I was intending to go down on the Friday after Steve died to sort out the final chapter, then go away and write it once we'd both been through it point by point. But I was able to do that final conclusive essay. Then we hadn't squared up or firmed up the artwork. And so that took a great deal of time. I believe that although it's completely random how this has worked out, I think this is a good time for the book to be coming out, where I think that magic, we need magic, and the kind of magic that we've got, to my mind, is very often not pulling its weight. It should be, I believe, at the very center of culture, and it shouldn't be a kind of an esoteric pastime. I think it's more important than that. And if we can put that point of view forward with the Book of Magic in a popular form, maybe other people will be able to see that as well.
Well, I'm relieved having learned that from you. So good. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take some questions.
Sure, absolutely. Far away.
Can I just ask you a question, which is, could you give a tip on how to be a bit more magical?
Trying to be more creative, perhaps, would be a good way into it. Whatever field of creation you're interested in, try applying yourself to that. Because, to my mind, all acts of creation are magical. All the arts are magical, particularly writing. And also, try to consider the immaterial world as being a real place. And start from there and see where your thoughts lead you. That would be my main tip.
Thanks very much. Here we go.
Hello. What is magic for? It's not for material results. What is it for? What do you get out of it?
What you get out of it, as far as I'm concerned, is it's always for knowledge. The way Aleister Crowley defined magic was to bring about changes in the world in accordance with one's will. Now, I don't think that magic works like that, as we were just saying about sigil magic and chaos magic. I I think that the way you bring about changes in the world with magic is to first bring about changes in yourself. You transform yourself into the kind of person who can conceivably bring about changes in the world. That will work. I think that once you apply magic to something, to material ends, so what would that be? For getting more money for yourself? Why not actually use your magical ideas to do some work and get money in a perfectly normal way? There aren't many really just applications or moral applications of magic in the material world. What you have to do is to first transform yourself and then act upon the world as best you can. That is, I believe, how magic works. Yeah, it always comes down to the Faust thing, that it's the quest for knowledge that is the only important thing about magic. And of course, as with Faust, it's probably the quest for knowledge that undoes us all.
Good evening. Thanks for your time and speaking with us. Can you please show us what the words on your mug says?
It says, to-do list, 1, wake up, drink tea, and be an awesome magician. I can generally manage the first 2, but I'm happy if I can manage the first 1, to be perfectly honest, at this age. So yeah, that's what it says.
Hello. I was reading Roebuck in the Thicket recently about the Robert Cochrane tradition of witchcraft, and it went into detail about how he really enjoyed cultivating ambiguity of what was mystical, arcane lore that had been passed down to him personally, and what was just some cobblers he'd plucked out of the air, basically. And he claimed that this was an established magical practice to stop people knowing enough about you and your views and practices to be able to hex you or cross you or anything like that. And I was curious as to whether it was an established practice or if it was more cobblers he was enjoying.
It may have been more the latter, more towards the cobbler's end of the spectrum. Me and Steve were perhaps very different in our approach to magic to a lot of magical practitioners, but we couldn't see, if you genuinely know something about something like magic, or you believe that you know something or that you worked something out, why not share it with everybody? I mean, if you don't have a desire to suddenly make it into a marketable thing where you sort of you form a cult and sort of get people to give you all their money and drip feed them bits of information. If you don't want to do that, then surely just do it in as clear a way as possible, make it available to everybody. There perhaps are people out there who've cursed me. I've not really noticed any effects, sort of sometimes you have bad days, but it doesn't mean that we're under a curse. Probably is more for show, saying things like that. If you actually think you know something, then share it. Allow people to criticize it. Allow people to say, no, you've got completely the wrong idea, and to provide an argument as to why your ideas are wrong. If you're confident in your ideas, I don't see why you shouldn't do that. Magic seems to me to be a kind of an open source thing. It's just laying around there like the ocean. Everybody is free to go in and have a paddle. That's my opinion.
John, what's it like working with Ellen Moore? It's a lot of fun. I mean, we've known each other for some time. This was actually very easy to do because Alan gave his blessing to me, just kind of going away and doing my best with it. Well, we had two instructions, that it was beautiful and psychedelic. That was your express instruction. And especially because we'd had quite a few things where they didn't quite come off, did they? I mean, I was telling Gary about the first collaboration we were going to do, which was Yugos Cultures.
Yeah.
And that was stymied because you left your manuscript in a
taxi cab. Yeah.
This in someone's garden shed, probably. Call myself a floating member of the cabal.
You are one of the leading non-members of this non-existent organization, John. I knew that you knew what we meant. Make it beautiful, make it psychedelic.
I always call myself a child of the magical revival because my mother was a Dennis Wheatley fan who accumulated a handful of paperbacks, which I don't think she ever really read. She'd got William Seabrook's The Magic Island, Voodoo, and Richard Cavendish's The Black Arts, and all these ended up in my bedroom. And Man, Myth and Magic as well. I mean, she had the first 6 issues of Man, Myth and Magic. She just used to buy these things and then not really read them, but they'd be left lying around the house. And so for me, as a child, it was a thing that was there. It's always been kind of at the background of things that I do. And really, this is the first time I've been able to do it, bring it all to the surface consciously and really kind of work it into something physical.
Hi there. Another question. You explained your vision for magic really clearly, and it's very compelling, and looking forward to the book. But having formulated that vision, are you aware of any times and places where that kind of magic was flourishing, or at least you suspect it was?
We believe that the absolute heart of magic, as we understand it, was probably in Alexander of Abenotochus's Glaucon and Selene shows, which I started out worshipping Glaucon as a kind of intellectual joke, a kind of Gnostic joke, but then I realised that actually there's more to this, and it's one that me and Steve saw a great deal of use and purpose in. The most important precedent for our kind of magical worldview.
Alan, what do you miss most about Steve?
Well, nothing except everything, really. I've stopped having dreams about him. What I will miss is I'll be thinking about some fact or something like that, something that I'm not sure of, and just for a moment I think, right, I'll have to ask Steve the next time it's having access to that mind and to that personality. In terms of my magical development, he was an extraordinary compliment to my own thinking, because I tend to be very excitable and bombastic. I'll get an idea and I'll think, right, this is definitely true because it's me who's thinking it. And I will just run with it. Whereas Steve, who had actually been properly educated, would so often temper my flights of fantasy. And I remember once when we were doing the Lives of the Great Enchanters, and we got to Paracelsus, and after finding out that Paracelsus had been the father of much modern medicine, I remember that I asked Steve, I said, Steve, is it possible that Paracelsus was the inventor of paracetamol? And I shall never forget the look of scorn that Steve subjected me to. So I do need a look of scorn occasionally. And that is one of the things that I miss about Steve. When Steve died, the main thing that I inherited from him was his picture of Selene, which, according to the principles of statue animation, is the goddess Selene. So we had to have somewhere for her to live. Melinda had got a couple of spare dolls' houses, so she painted up one of the dolls' houses and we furnished it inside, and we've got little figures that represent Steve. When the Somnium book came out, I know that this is all delusional, but I took it up and showed it to him. I've showed him the Book of Magic. We make little birthday cards to send to them every year.
So he doesn't know about it then?
As far as I understand it, yes, Steve knows about it.
Well, I think that's a great moment to stop. So I want to say thanks very much to John Coulthart. I want to say thanks very much to Gary Lachman. Woo! And I want a very big London Month of the Dead thanks to Alan Moore. Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, both at the time and in the edit. I've done a few events with Alan over the years. He's amazing. There's something deeply wise and kind about him. He's very sweet and very humble, actually. He still lives at the terraced house in Northampton where he's lived for years. Quite reluctant to leave it these days. He just gets on with his writing and his practice of magic. I previously interviewed him during COVID, actually, on the subject of counterculture, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, along with a link to the Bumper Book of Magic and a link to Gary's work and to John Coulthart's work. Thanks for listening. Let's keep listening. If you want to know more about us, about the events that we do and about all the stories that we publish, come and join us, bureauoflostculture.com. Thanks as ever to everybody who's written in with suggestions and appreciation. We love to hear from friends. And I will see you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more tales from the underground, from the counterculture, and from the other side.